generation to see the forefathers of business. How exactly, what are those words that they used to think about that used to drive them? And some of them, out of the experiences that they incurred in running business, they decided to come up with some of these statements because they were coming from a place of experience and knowledge. Well, let's get into this. Well, work hard often, that is definitely what we talk about all the time. Working hard, and of course somebody there was saying you need to focus on social media because this is one of the ways you can keep in touch with your customers, getting to understand what exactly they feel like, and you capitalize that. And social media of late has come up with what we call new developments in terms of business analytics, or what we call data analytics, whereby you can be in position to follow up the impact of what you post, how many people consume what you post, people that react. All those statistics are important, and when you get to see all this, they drive decision making. I mean, you don't make business decisions out of emotions, and I feel like that has been part of the key challenges that the local business community has largely faced in our country, Uganda. That is from the perspective of making business decisions from an emotional point of view. Yet I don't think it should be from that perspective, because it lacks information, it lacks facts. But how do you get these facts? Digitization is a key space here. So if you have your transactions digitized, when you know that commodity X is what is I sold today, commodity B, C, D, E, and so many more, it's going to be quite much more easy for you to keep the trend. And when you go back to that software, it will make for you the analytics for you to know what commodity was on high demand in this month, and what commodity made more sales for my company this month. And once you have all those statistics ready, I can assure you, you'll be able to make right business decisions, informed business decisions, which is something quite key and positive. Now, away from that, Africa is it's actually continents filled with countries in huge debt, if you are to, consider. Now, we see that more than 32 countries are currently on high risk of debt distress, a development which has led many governments concentrating more on servicing their debt while depriving the social spending. Yeah, from that perspective. Now, even at the World Economic Forum, part of the key discussions were in line with how best can debts in African nations be restructured, because if you are to compare it from that perspective. Now, Africa's total debt increased, that is to about $1.31 trillion in 2024 from $238 billion in 2000. But of course, putting into the inflation factors and the depreciation of the currency over the time. So it brings us to that perspective. Now, of course, this came to light with the 4th edition of the African Forum and Network on Debt Development. That is the Afrodad Media Initiative in Abidjan, Ivory Coast. Of course, a group of media personalities gathering in there to see how this can be really gone. How can we go about this as a continent? What advice should we give to the economic policy planners, the policy makers, to get into this perspective? And if you get to realize still, when we had the G77 plus China and the non-alignment movement, part of the key discussions were in line with the Bretton Woods institutions' terms of lending money to the developing countries, something which they feel the loans, most of the entire budgets of these countries are spent on servicing these loans. Uganda is a good example where we are standing at over 100 trillion Ugandan 100 trillion shillings debt that we as a country, Uganda. So that is quite a huge sum of figure. Almost 50% of the budget is financing the debt, not only for Uganda, but also other African countries. And this massive exploitation has costed the citizens of these countries. It has hindered their participation in the national economies, because governments are always thinking about to raise money to pay back the states. Before you know it, new taxes are introduced. If new taxes are not introduced, we see the aspect of taxes increasing every other day. You know, inflation increasing at a high rate, commercial banks increasing interest rates. We're now operating at about 24% in Uganda, Rwanda, I think, also still in that bracket, around 23%. Tanzania being quite fair, operating at 18% interest rate. But all this comes about due to the debt distress, as compared to China, where somebody gets a loan at 3%. And actually, the fact that we are focusing more on debt distress has led our limited participation in the economic activity in the manufacturing sector, which has given the foreigners coming in from the very countries that lend us money to come and compete in our very own space, because they can borrow money at low interest rate. I'm just giving an example. If a Chinese can get money from Exim Bank at an interest rate of about 3%, 5%, and you're competing with him who's getting a loan at 24%, I mean, that is quite not ideal in that way. So, but what is causing all this? Debt distress. We are financing debt servicing at the expense of social living and the economic livelihood of the individuals. So these are part of the key discussions that are being put in place. Now, of course, the initiative is being held under the theme Empowering Media towards an Impactful African Debt Campaign. Now, of course, the Afrodad Executive Director, that is Jason Brangaza, expressed the regret that African countries had contributed to be victims of debt, with over 32 currently on high risk of debt distress. I think Somalia is part of the country where we saw the Paris Club restructuring Somalia's debt. I think about this very week, I think we had a story in our Caribbean East Africa, still in line with that. So how long are we going to be really thinking of debt distress? And of course, this brings me to a very key and sensitive question about, are we going to keep on borrowing this money? I mean, concessional loans, we are borrowing money to pay salaries for luxury. We are borrowing money to pay government, to buy government officials cars and unnecessary expenditures. And you see, we are always seeking for fair measures from these Bretton Woods institutions on what terms they should lend us this money. But we don't look on the side of how do we actually utilize this money. I think that would be the big question, you know. Yes, put up the infrastructure. I understand that the debt will be there. You will have to service this debt. But after some time, the return on investment is going to be, experienced, because we borrow this money, construct projects which prolong for a long time. And we know that if the project takes long in project management, I mean, the cost increases over time, because you have to pay the workers that appear every day, if it's not completed in time. So if the project was supposed to be done in 5 years' time and it exceeds up to 15 years' time, so for all the works that are done in the extra 10 years, there is a cost you are incurring as a government. So before you know it, you borrowed money for that project as a country, and again you have to borrow money to complete that project. Yet if you had estimated well, that would be something quite effective. Now, there is also something I've realized, that some of the investments in African nations that we do, if you compare their return on investment vis-a-vis the initial input, it doesn't really match up in that line. Now, of course, for this discussion, I'm joined with Rona Nahabwe. She's, of course, from in Ivory Coast, coming live in Ivory Coast, Abidjan. She's part of this Afrodad, the media campaign. And let's see what is really happening. A very good morning, Rona. How are you there, that side?
Very good, Andrew. I'm not quite sure if you can see me. But it's such, so if you can see me, just give me a sign.
So probably if we could have a discussion in line so far for the days you've had there, what are some of the key conclusions we've come up with in terms of handling the debt in Africa?
Well, that's an interesting question, and it's been such a privilege to have joined the other countries, which are about 40 countries that have convened in Abidjan, Ivory Coast, to discuss the most important thing, Africa debt. We realize that for a while, most of the things that have really taken our interest are far from it, but a debt is actually eating us up, and the rest of African countries can really testify, because we do know that we have some of the countries that whose debt now is above the IMF recommended levels. So you would want to ask me what is it in for Uganda? For Uganda, for the last a few months, the debt has now surged, and that is according to the report by the Auditor General report, which was released on 12th February. That said that our public debt now is about 96.1 trillion shillings, which is about $25.3 billion, and that is 52% the GDP ratio, which is above the recommended by IMF. IMF recommendations say that we should not exceed 50%. Now, as you can see, we are already starting to swim in the high-end water. We are about to join the likes of Sierra Leone, DRC, Ghana, and other countries who are now heavily indebted. So, of course, this discussion has really been pertinent, but it has come at a time when, of course, we have just started the year, and we should really put our focus on that. We realize that there are very many factors as the reason to why we are heavily indebted as a nation, as Africa. And because of that, there hasn't been any human capital development, because then much of the money that is collected or that is budgeted for is spent in public and private investment. That would be spent in public and private investment is spent on servicing the debt. So you also realize that there are very many factors. I think if you just like you rightly mentioned, there are very many factors that have contributed to the high indebtedness. The fact that we are so much enticed to borrow more that we find ourselves having a level of debt that has surged and is unsustainable for the 32 countries now that I would say that are in high debt district.
Me personally, I have a feeling, because if you remember the G77 summit that happened in our country, Uganda, part of the key perspectives were in line with the Bretton Woods institutions, that is the IMF and the World Bank, when it comes to when they are lending the African countries money with the strings attached to that money, which is okay, and we are thinking of how this can be handled in favor of us. But I don't know whether we are addressing the issue of, shall we always be talking about restructuring our debts, yet we don't talk about aspects to do with how do we utilize these debts exactly? Because to me, it's like I'm lending you money and you want me to work on your terms to give me my money. Now, that is my issue. How are we really handling into that? I think that is the core of this entirety of how do we spend this money when we actually acquire these debts. So what position do we hold to tell IMF that lend us money on these terms?
Okay, so as part of the some of the talking points that were highlighted yesterday from the, from the, uh, so as part of the talking points that were highlighted yesterday from the media workshop that is happening here in Abidjan, we realized that there are some countries that have already applied for debt restructuring. We mentioned there was a mention of Chad and Zambia, but Uganda has not applied for debt restructuring, and you would want to ask yourself why. Could it be that the debt perhaps not be restructured? Could it be that they do not have the means, or could it be that they're even illiterate to know that they can actually apply for that? Because now we're looking at the measures to reduce and make this debt sustainable. One of which is debt servicing, which is now crippling the economy, because as you can see, the heavy enforcement from Euro to make sure that every Ugandan pays their debt. And also, I would also like to mention that as part of the Auditor General report, we also noted that every Ugandan, which is over 45 million Ugandans right now, are indebted to a tune of 25 million Ugandan cedis. Now you can imagine that. You can imagine how that would sound to a Ugandan who pays their fair share of taxes, that is being told that they owe 2.5 million. It's quite absurd. But as part of the reason, or as part of the measures that could be put in place to help countries like Uganda that are now starting to swim in the high-end waters, is to apply for debt restructuring. And why do you think that could? How do you think that could happen? Could they have say whenever whenever they decide to convene with IMF or World Bank? Could they be listened to? That's also a question we would want to ask. Then also, we should also want to know, before even the debt restructuring, there is something we've also learned that is quite interesting, and I believe that it's not quite known, or I would find it very peculiar for Ugandans or for the Ugandan government to have really engaged in something that has to do with interpreting the law, the contract law. And all we need to know in regards to signing agreements, binding agreements, legal binding agreements, and all that the kind of agreements that we're signing for, especially for a loan. You realize that there is misrepresentation, because we actually looked at one case study of Kenya and Italy, where we realized that there was only one person representing Kenya, and there were like 3 people representing Italy. So you already know that there is capitalism in that whole decision. Of course, the other people are going to be outweighed, and the decision is going to be made in the favor of the oppressors, for lack of a better word. So as part of the measures that I was about to mention was the debt servicing that Uganda is already doing, which, by the way, in the last quarter of 2023, there was a decline in the revenue that was collected. And actually, the Permanent Secretary of Finance requested for a meeting with Zera to find out why is it that we have collected less than 600 billion shillings. So you already know that we're not collecting up to our target, at least for the last quarter of 2023. Then we also understand debt servicing, which Uganda now is currently doing, and that is happening because of the issue of high interest rates. Because the interest rates are too high that we find ourselves almost a big chunk of the budget, or almost half, or almost all of it goes to debt servicing. When we find that we have to borrow for the budget, and yet we could have spent the money for the budget that we have collected from the taxes to service our people. Because the most important thing, Andrew, is that the person, the omuntu awansi, or what a Kenyan would call the wananchi or Antico, is the one that is going to feel the pinch whenever a country is in high debt distress. There is not going to be enough healthcare access. There is not going to be education that is accessible to the person down there that cannot, access the basic needs by their own. I mean, people living with aesthetic could find life normal, but there are people that are struggling, and that is because the government has not extended resources, and that is precisely because it has spent a big chunk of its budget servicing the loan.
To also another technical aspect here, as much as because most of these loans, we know we obtain them for developing of these projects and all these Are we coming up with some alternative ways alternative sources of financing of our African economies? Are we thinking about them in terms of being competitive? For example, if we are to talk about the export, being competent in the export market, because even what we already export out there, what we sell to bring in income on the continent, is not yet as much competitive on the global market. So what are other alternatives? Personally, this is what I think. If we can raise enough money through our output in terms of the value addition, we can have money to service our economies within. Are we having discussions? Are we even intending to have discussions heading into that line?
I think that's a discussion that we should be having today. But maybe to just give you my personal opinion or my logic, what my logic tells me is that we're going to fail in that area because, I mean, you can see how the trading blocks are doing already. So Africans themselves are a problem. They are not trading among themselves. They have the inferiority complex, and they feel that they can only prosper by relying on the foreign powers and the Western powers. And that's why we find ourselves circling around this we call the district, because we do not have enough capacity, or we think that we do not have enough capacity. You can see how FCTA is doing, that least Kenya have tried to trade in it, but I do not know the story for Uganda. We already know what is happening with trade blocks from EFA, you can mention SADC, ECOWAS. The other time, a person from Sierra Leone or Senegal was mentioning something in regards to that. So we need to first come together as Africans. And I think last month there was a meeting of African leaders where they had to just talk about everything that it has to do with finance, financial debt, and the like. And I really would like to believe, or would like to hope, that they came up with a collective approach to the problem that they are currently facing, which is debt. You may not believe it, but you have no idea how debt is eating up some of the countries. Let me just give you a small statistic. We do know that countries like Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, a country very rich in minerals, but has nothing to show for it, especially when you look at their economic country, and if you look at the population, you realize that they are heavily indebted, and they have even surpassed the IMF's recommended, which is now about 91%. We have countries like Sierra Leone that are swimming around 80%, Ghana 77 something, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, where we are right now. Very many countries are heavily indebted. Actually, we think that Uganda is quite lucky. Perhaps our GDP, 52 compared to our GDP is also not too good, and we are headed the wrong way, because if you continue like that, it's going to get to 60, and who knows when it will get to 90, when we be like the likes of the DRC. Also, to mention some unique statistics is that the recent research from AFSED revealed that Africa's public debt had soared up to $1.8 trillion in 2022. $1.8 trillion in 2022. Now, Uganda currently has a chunk of $25.3 billion. But if you relate it to what the country collects and what the other countries, or what they are, and how much, their GDP and their reserves, which I would also would love to touch a bit about, especially when you relate it with special drawing rights, you realize that it's terrible, and not very many people. Not very person would just know how big of a deal the African debt is right now. People would like to hear anything about gossip, anything out of the politics. I would say not knowing that countries are heavily indebted, and Uganda among them.
Maybe just something small in just about 3 minutes, because if we are to weigh part of this money we borrow as a continent, I feel there is this whole idea of political extremism, getting to see that most of this money is actually obtained in terms of, some leaders to still have the political leverage in the countries. And I feel like if we don't have the mindset shift in terms of being economic oriented, it's going to cost us. Is it part of the aspects in terms of the minds? How far have we gone in terms of that mindset change? Because that greed of political positioning comes in a way that borrowing all this money is spent on military. Take a look at most of these governments. A lot of the budgets is on military, which has no return on investment, definitely in further losses.
Yeah. You're right in saying it, Andrew. And it says one thing this media training has made me appreciate is that we have the same problems as Africa. I mean, over 40 countries are convening there. And by the way, it's now about 31 minutes past 5. So we already know the time difference, I mean, of course, West Africa. But in regards to mindset, our leaders are just selfish. I would say that. Our leaders are just selfish, at least from what I gathered from DRC, Ghana, Nigeria, Gambia, Sierra Leone, Malawi, Zambia, Zimbabwe, all those countries that have been really in Abidjan, just trying to understand the issues of public health. And also, there is something that is very, 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 very unusual, I would call it, to hear that I understood that we Africans have failed. We are illiterate, I would say. We do not invest enough in understanding the laws, the concept of law, the kind of agreements we're signing, how binding they are, how legal they are, what is our share, what do we do when we want to revert, So I believe a lot of wrongs are done because you realize that the agreements of loans are signed behind closed doors. They can only announce as little as possible. Within their mandate not to just not tell you anything. So we are not at any leverage to understand and also change the mindset that you ask in regards to approaching our African debt. We are, I would say, we are not at any leverage to have anything. And as you know, actually, we think that journalists in Uganda are being harassed and there's a lot of gatekeeping and mistreatment and I would put threatening of lives. In other countries, it's even worse. If you threaten to just expose anything in regards to hidden documents and the loans that have been tied behind closed doors, you're as good as dead. So the mindset just has to come from our leaders,
And maybe before we go out of here, how have you found Ivory Coast? I mean, how are the people there in terms of humor? And is it so hot there like the side?
I like that question because I was really hoping I would actually start with it. You might have noticed that my eyes are a little bit sore. It's about 33 minutes past 5. So there is already a time difference of about 3 hours from West Africa. But in regards to the people, I've not really interacted much with them. We tend to have a city tour today. Maybe perhaps I would be able to do that. But the city is quite lovely. I'm embarrassed for my country. I wish I could have time to just show you some of the videos so that you see what I've been able to capture, so that you see how beautiful the city is. Very clean, no sign of a pothole, like what we are used to. And they seem to be less populated. The cars are more than the people, I would say. So the only thing maybe I would say an ick for me is the food. You just have to appreciate the food. Appreciate the country having the food. Appreciate the food you have in the country.
It's been a pleasure to have you on this discussion. We shall definitely be having further interactions later on, even tomorrow, to see how far we have gone in terms of this. Well, Smart means business, 25 minutes to the top of the hour. And of course, we're going to take a short break and I'm returning with the business and entertainment. Stick around.